It's Kevin Meagher, who's up at the Labour Party conference, author and analyst of all things Ireland, as well as a few things Labour. Kevin Meagher, thank you for joining us. I'll not ask you to play your guitar in lieu of Roger Waters, but you're looking marvellous, I must say.
I'll give it.
Before we turn to Ireland, let's go to the war zone, war-torn Labour conference in Brighton. What do you make of the show so far?
It's been a very difficult week to begin with, and as I say, difficult week. We're still on Sunday. It's been very difficult for Keir Starmer so far. He's obviously tried to bring forward some pretty big internal party changes, which have run into the sand with opposition from the left of the party, but also from a noticeable silence from people who might be his erstwhile allies. How much of this actually cuts through with the general public is a moot point, really. And it's all to play for, I suspect, for him on Wednesday when he addresses the conference, which will be for the first time, obviously, given the COVID lockdown. It's the first time he's had the chance to actually stand at the podium for an hour or so and actually lay out his stall to the British people. So we'll see what happens close of play Wednesday. But British politics is going through quite a tumultuous period. We're down to kind of one word, really. Brexit, COVID, Boris have dominated the last 5 or 6 years. And looking at the opinion polls today, the Conservatives still have a pretty decent lead in the polls, given we've got all the problems that we've got that are stemming from Brexit and from COVID, fuel shortages and the like. I've driven down here to Brighton on England's south coast this afternoon, and I've passed by 20 or so service stations coming down the M1 from the north of England, and every single one of them has run out of fuel. So the government's got some real domestic issues to grapple with. That's usually a great opportunity for an opposition leader to make hay and make capital and actually set themselves up as an alternative government. So really, it's all down to Keir Starmer on Wednesday to pull off the performance of a lifetime.
It would have to be the performance of any lifetime, judging by the local council election results, real votes from real people. Every Thursday, they seem to get worse and worse. But even our old friend, Desperate Dan Hodges, in the Mail on Sunday, has finally called time on Keir Starmer. He quotes him as saying, "I don't get politics, I don't understand it, I don't like it." That seems to me to be the message written on Keir Starmer's face most of the time.
Well, he's got a huge problem. He's not only dealing with the aftermath of the 2019 election, where obviously Labour was reduced to its lowest number of MPs since 1935. He's got a longer-term problem for the Labour Party. The Labour Party has been in power between 1997 and 2010, 13 years. We had the financial crisis there at the end. Labour, as it was in the 1950s and was in the 1980s, is kind of looking inwards and asking what kind of a party it is. Is it a party that wants to make incremental change and work with the grain, or is it a party that wants to make transformational change and actually tip the apple cart up? This is a question the Labour Party goes through every generation. So in a sense, there's nothing new here. I mean, British politics is an agglomeration of interests. Because of the system we've got, the first past the post system, the party of the right, the Conservatives, and the party of the left, Labour, have got to agglomerate huge amounts of political space and huge amounts of difference of opinion as well. And synthesising all of that and producing something that can actually win an election is a huge challenge for the Labour Party. And the Conservative Party historically has just been much, much better at it. The Tories take a view of what's unpopular, leaders or policies, they just ditch them and they move on. Labour finds that much, much harder to do. And this process is dragged out for a huge number of years. I mean, the party's been in opposition now since 2010. So we're in the kind of 11th year of opposition and political futility in a sense. The opportunity arises, though, because of the impact of COVID and the impacts of Brexit and some of the problems that the current government has got, that actually if the Labour Party gets its act together in the next 18 months, there is a huge opportunity to win the next general election, or to do certainly considerably better than the party managed in recent times. But at the moment, it's a party that's looking inwards and tearing strips off each other. I mean, there's no way of hiding that. And parties that are divided simply aren't going to win an election. So the problem for Labour is to restore some equilibrium, to restore some sense of discipline and common purpose from across its different tribes, because the opportunity is there, because we've got a government that's making quite a hash of things at the moment.
Well, of course, famously, if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle. We'll see how that all pans out. But haunting the conference, like Banquo's ghost, is, of course, one Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader. Indeed, he was the leader just 2 years ago. Now he's not even a Labour MP, kicked out by Keir Starmer. But the Labour Party hasn't kicked him out. Only Keir Starmer has kicked him out. This is all indicative of half in, half out, semi-detached, willing to wound but not to kill. The Labour Party must be heading, surely, for a final reckoning on these things. Otherwise, you're going to have this Banquo's ghost haunting your party until the end of time, until the end of his time, anyway.
That's true. I mean, it's a fair point to say. Actually, you've got a kind of Jeremy Corbyn in a halfway house. He was suspended from the party, then brought back into the party, then suspended from the parliamentary party, where he remains currently suspended. But of course, he's a darling of the conference fringe, even tonight as well. So yes, it's a problem. It's a mess. The Labour Party, as you well know, George, is a coalition of interests stemming from democratic socialists, social democrats, different geographies, people with often quite different views of politics and political life. And the Labour Party is always at its best when it can amalgamate these different interests and synthesize them and produce something that everybody can live with. That's when it wins elections in the 1960s and in the 1990s as well. When it doesn't do that well, it becomes quite vociferous and divided, and people question whether they're actually in the right party because they disagree with people within the same party so fundamentally. The Tory party is just much, much better at concealing its difficulties in its internal tribulations and internal wounds. Labour plays them all out in open for everybody to see. But I mean, the bottom line is in democratic politics is the voters are always looking. And if the voters don't like what you're offering, or they just say, look, you're a disorganised rabble and you can't even agree amongst yourselves, you're not going to win an election. And if you can't win an election, that should be just as much an issue of concern for Keir Starmer as it is for Jeremy Corbyn or anybody on the left, as it is for anybody on the Labour right as well, because that means political redundancy. And unfortunately, that's the kind of ground Labour's in at the moment, that it looks as though it's more interested in its internal wrangling than it does in providing an offer for the country to unite around. Now, as I say, we're potentially 18 months away from a general election where the public will have a say over COVID, over the impacts of Brexit, over the impacts of Boris Johnson's premiership. And it feels to me like there's a genuine moment there where a lot of people might say, look, I'm looking for an alternative to that. And it's up to Labour really to provide that alternative. And that's the bottom line for the party. And that's how British politics works, I'm afraid.
But they seem to have an almost masochistic, certainly fetishistic attachment to going against the grain. Angela Rayner's rant might have won her some more voters, though not according to our poll, in any Labour leadership campaign, but won't have won her any voters at all amongst the electorate. Keir Starmer's rejection today of public ownership. You and I are both old enough to remember the Central Electricity Generating Board, publicly owned and doing a grand job in distributing power in the country. He rejected any going back to public ownership of the energy distribution sector. He also, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, he rejected Andrew Marr's point that only women have cervixes. He said that's not right. Like a mad professor. He couldn't explain why it wasn't right, because it very obviously is right in terms of science and biology. Why do they fix themselves to such unpopular points of view?
It's a very good question. I mean, just on the last point, I mean, I think we've reached a point where people are elevating sociology over biology, and I think that's the nub of that debate. I mean, it's interesting that if you roll back 3 or 4 years, it was a Conservative government. It was a Conservative minister in Justice Greening, who was then the Equalities Minister, who brought forward a green paper about self-identification for trans people, which very nearly ended up on the statute book without any real interrogation or public discussion. And it's interesting that the Conservative Party has resiled a very long way from that position today, and Labour, alas, is ripping itself to bits on these points, which to the general public just seem frankly mad. They seem so abstract and so self-absorbed and delusional that they look and sort of say, well, if that's the kind of thing that you think is important, rather than jobs or housing or the cut to universal credit, for example, if you think those issues are more important than everyday real issues that affect real people and real families, then are you fit to govern? And that's the nub of Labour's dilemma. It needs to get onto ground which reflects the realities of the British public, but also of those very many seats, particularly in the north of England and the East and West Midlands, that Labour lost often for the first time ever in 2019. It's got to win all these places back. Never mind winning back Scotland, which of course is I know a cause close to your heart, George. But I mean that seems a million miles away right now. Now that's how Labour produces a coalition that can actually govern the country, that pulls together Scotland, the north of England, the industrial heartlands, and enough middle class marginals in the south of England to actually govern. That's how it's done it in the past. And at the moment, it looks like a very tall order to pull all that together.
Now, you're the go-to man on Ireland, have been for me for many, many years. Bring us up to date with what's happening in the north of the country, where politics appears to be up a gum tree.
Well, I mean, we've had an opinion poll a few weeks ago, which has caused a not insignificant amount of consternation between the unionist parties, which shows that the Democratic Unionists, which are the largest of the unionist parties, people often think there's just one, but there are in fact 3 or 4 that reflect different strands of opinion. That the DUP, which currently holds the position of First Minister and has been dominant for the last 15 years or so, is starting to really struggle. And partly that's a result of the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the agreement that Boris Johnson agreed to as part of his Brexit withdrawal agreement, which ensures that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland, which is replete with all kinds of significance in terms of the troubles and the period before, razor wire and watchtowers and all the rest of it. We don't want that to go back to that. But it requires, because Britain is obviously leaving the European Union, has a land border with the Republic of Ireland, it requires border checks happen somewhere. And the government are lighted on having them take place at the ports. This is the Northern Ireland Protocol. Unionists and loyalists, the more militant version of unionists, are up in arms about this, to put it mildly. They see Northern Ireland being treated differently than the rest of the UK, that there is a physical division in terms of the checks on goods and coming into Northern Ireland. They're very irate about it. There's been lots of protests over the summer by loyalists, which have involved some fairly sinister protests, petrol bombs, ripping up copies of the Good Friday Agreement, lots of graffiti on walls, and all the rest of it. And the DUP is suffering the fallout from this. They are held accountable by loyalists from whom they draw a lot of their electoral support because they trusted Boris Johnson, basically, that he wouldn't institute a hard border at the borders, which is exactly what he's done. The DUP are reaping a whirlwind from this. They've seen their electoral support half in opinion polls. They've got support drifting both ways. So the Ulster Unionist Party, which is a slightly more liberal version of the DUP, they're gaining support off the back of the DUP's difficulties, and traditional Ulster voice, traditional Unionist voice rather, which is a Paisleyite sect and has been regarded as kind of beyond the fringe really. It's also drawing support away from the DUP. So in effect, you've got the Unionist vote splintering three different ways, which has the effect of making Sinn Féin in opinion polls the largest party by a considerable margin. Now, we've got elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly that are due to take place next May, which would see potentially Sinn Féin top the poll and therefore take the role of First Minister of Northern Ireland. Now, it doesn't matter in some regards because First Minister, Deputy First Minister are a joint office. It's a way to make sure from the time of the Good Friday Agreement that you couldn't have unionist majority control, which is, of course, is the problem that led to the Troubles in the first place in the 1960s. So the joint offices, but it's that sort of pecking order that changes, where Sinn Féin are kind of top of the pops. Now, unionists find this, a real kind of signifier of their long-term decline. So you get all kinds of noises off from the fringe saying, well, we don't want that, we want pacts. The Ulster Unionist Party yesterday said that they weren't going to agree on a pact with the Democratic Unionists. There's talk of, well, we'll crash the institutions. Jeffrey Donaldson, the new leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, has talked about if there aren't major reforms to the Northern Ireland Protocol by Christmas, that he will crash the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement and power sharing, which of course would be massively destabilising and massively significant. Because he thinks he's drifting towards a major reckoning with the electorate in May anyway. Now, the British government's trying to make effectively some cosmetic changes to the protocol. There's no argument about the protocol staying. Some unionists, some loyalists are up in arms saying they want the protocol to be scrapped entirely. That's just not realistic. The British government recognises that's just not realistic. So what it's looking from the European Commission are a few cosmetic changes to some of the checks to make them slightly less onerous, so there's no delay in goods transferring across from Great Britain that are going to be used in Northern Ireland for a domestic market. So that's the kind of the nub of the deal. That's what the government's trying to get to try and prop up the DUP so that it doesn't face this kind of apocalyptic electoral reckoning in May, which may or may not happen. But of course, this all fits in the wider rubric of the future of Northern Ireland. This is the centenary year of Northern Ireland, and it's never looked, frankly, in worse shape than it does today. And on the other side of the equation, you've got nationalists and Republicans in Sinn Féin that are looking and thinking we've never been closer to the historic goal of Irish reunification, and that's very much on their agenda. And if these institutions are brought down by the Democratic Unionists, and if they don't want to play ball, and if they don't want to recognise that perhaps a Sinn Féin politician should be First Minister, if there's any of that kind of game playing, then I think the growing view amongst Sinn Féin and amongst constitutional nationalists as well is that actually, look, it's then a united Ireland or nothing. They want a border poll to put this issue out there because they've kind of had enough of some of the DUP's game playing. Because of course the DUP was a very strong supporter of Brexit on the basis, frankly, that they thought what Brexit would entail is that if it makes Northern Ireland less European, it also makes Northern Ireland less Irish. And I think what they hoped for was, frankly, that they would unfurl razor wire across the Irish border with watchtowers and barking Alsatians. And of course, that was never going to happen.
That ain't happening. We'll have to stay in touch with you about this because I think this will be the big story of 2022.